Good afternoon, everyone, to this afternoon session about fake news in science, how recognizing it and how to fight it. My name is Andreas Hirstein, and I'm pleased that you found the way to Lausanne and in particular into this room. First of all, thanks a lot to the organizers of this event, in particular to my colleague Martin Amrein. We work together at a Sunday newspaper in Zurich called NZZ am Sonntag, in the German-speaking part, Zurich, which is the capital city of Switzerland.
I thought Bern was.
Maybe nobody, some people may have noticed it. This was just the first fake news of the evening, because Zurich is not the capital city. Switzerland is a federation without any formal capital. Bern is the city where the federal government resides, but it is not capital in the formal sense. I should tell you first that this panel, we have 70 minutes in total. We will, after my short introduction, we will have time for the discussion on the panel for about 45 minutes, and then I will open the panel for questions from the audience. So manipulating public opinion has become an easy game. At least that is the claim in the abstract of our panel today. However, fake news is not a new phenomenon. There are examples since ancient times where people invented rumors for their own benefit. Some used these rumors because it was their only means, because they had no other rights, especially people from underprivileged classes used rumors in order to fight for their rights, because, for instance, they did not have access to the courts in ancient Greece. What is new, however, is the speed at which fake news are distributed over the internet and in the social networks, as well as the ease with which it can be created. And that's why fake news has influenced public opinion and why it has influenced elections, most prominently probably in 2016 in the US during the presidential campaign. On the panel today, we will discuss how important the influence of these fake news really is, what can be done and what should be done against it, and who should take action. On the panel, I would like to welcome, first of all, Riko Muranaka. Riko on the sofa in the middle. Riko is a medical doctor, a journalist, and also a lecturer at Kyoto University. And nowadays, she also works for the Bernhard Nocht Institute for Tropical Science in Hamburg. In 2016, she landed something what we would call a scoop in our profession. She could show in an article that claims of severe side effects of an HPV vaccine were based on bad science, namely on a study which included just one mouse as an animal model, and that the study also included fabricated images. As a consequence, she was threatened by anti-vaxxers. She had problems getting her articles published in the media, and she even got sued by one of the scientists she criticized. However, her work was very much recognized in 2017 when she received the very prestigious John Maddox Prize in Great Britain for her standing up for sound science. On her left, we have Nir Grinberg. Nir is a research fellow at the Harvard Institute for Quantitative Social Science and the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University in Boston. In January of this year, he published with colleagues a very important study in the journal Science, where where the scientists had access to 16,000 Twitter accounts, and they could therefore analyze who in that network consumed fake news tweets and who shared them the most. That was not because the guys hacked these 16,000 accounts. there was an interface provided by Twitter so that the scientists could do their analysis. On my left, we have Scott Brennen. Scott is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and the Oxford Internet Institute. And what he studies is actually us, the work of journalists. For instance, in one of his latest publications, he looked into the reporting about artificial intelligence in British media. And what he found was a lot of false reporting. Not so much? No? Okay, so I'm wrong.
Fake news, man.
That was a false news, not a fake news, and that is a difference which we could maybe discuss later on. And if these two things, false and fake, are interrelated in some way. Far on the right-hand side, we have Joe Lynam. Joe Lynam is a business reporter. He has been working with the BBC for 17 years for different radio and television programs, and he took a short career break recently in order to help the EU Commission for their program on tackling disinformation. For instance, the EU has launched an action plan against disinformation, and most recently they have started a rapid alert system in order to detect and to inform people about fake news. Maybe he can explain to us later on what exactly that means. So let's start into the discussion. Riko, the first question is to you. I just mentioned it before that you have been sued by one of the scientists you criticized. What is the outcome of this trial?
Okay, before I was sued, the Japanese government was actually sued from the people who were claiming that drug injuries purportedly caused by the HPV vaccines. So just 1 week after the government was sued, for the first time in the history in the world, for the compensation for the drug injury or HPV vaccine, I was sued from the government-appointed researcher who was doing a research investigation for the HPV vaccine side adverse reactions. And then it took more than 2.5 years, and the decision was made in this March, and I lost the first district court case. And unfortunately, the publisher and also the editor-in-chief at that time accepted the decision. So I decided to appeal alone in early March, in early April. And what was that the government decided to give renewed grant for that researcher who sued me to continue the same study with the same design for another 3 years. And he is actually the ethical chair of Japan Physicians Association. So he published a new paper claiming the drug injury of this vaccine, which is proven to be safe and effective all over the world, in this February. And the plaintiffs group are submitting his new article as evidence of this the drug injury of this vaccine. So it's been a lot of trouble in Japan regarding this vaccine with the academia, the legal system, as well as the government's attitude.
And the problem with this campaign against the vaccine was not just academic, right? It had really influence on the vaccination rates in Japan.
Right, because it's a very strange decision that Japanese government made. They kept this vaccine in the national immunization program, but they just stopped proactively recommending it, which means just to stop sending a letter to the families of the eligible girls. And because of this attitude, people believed, or maybe the government is not sure about the safety of this vaccine, so nobody is using this vaccine anymore. And the vaccination dropped actually from nearly 80% to below 1 immediately after the government suspended the proactive recommendations for it. And now it is still 0.3% in all over Japan for eligible girls.
You said that your publisher accepted the verdict.
Yeah.
And you do not. So how are you going to proceed? I saw you launched this website
Yes.
in order to organize your trial and also to help other journalists.
Well, actually, this is not really initiated by myself. There is a group of doctors and scientists and also journalists. There are already over 300 people actually supporting this group to raise a fund for the journalists, including me, to when they are attacked legally or verbally or whatever socially, they just give support. So, but not only for raising money, they held they hold press conferences to say or explain the meaning of this decision or this lawsuit once in a while, and to also to promote some science connected to this lawsuit actually.
Hmm. Yeah, great. So if you are interested and if you want to have a look at this website, I think we could all become a member and help the journalists in Japan for such cases.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I guess I'm familiar with the sort of context around HPV vaccine in the US, but not at all in Japan. So maybe you could speak a little bit more about why the government is skeptical of the vaccine and, like, in your opinion, why you're kind of engaged in this kind of campaign.
Well, in the U.S., the HV vaccine anti-HV vaccine movement also prevalent.
Mhm.
I think the uptake is around 50%, but it's 0.3%. It's really strange in Japan. It's too low. One reason is because the government decision. They just made decision based on people's emotions, not based on science. And this policy decision, is criticized from the WHO for 3 times already in their statement. Although they just kept on suspending the proactive recommendations, right? That's one reason. Another reason is there is a scary video girls having seizures or on wheelchairs, which is actually filmed by the mobile phone of the parents of the girls who are having some symptoms after they are vaccinated with the vaccines. But those symptoms happening like 2 or 3 years after they are vaccinated, so it can be. There's no proof. There is no causal relation that is proven to be connected to the vaccinations, and also there are studies comparing the frequency of these symptoms that is to be set typically to HPV vaccine adverse reactions such as seizures. And those are the frequency is the same for vaccinated and non-vaccinated. But still, these results were not really published for after 2 years that the result was obtained because of the strong anti-vaccine movement from the civil groups. And they're recruiting more plaintiffs now, and there are over 250 people asking for the compensation to the government, and it will probably take 10 years. So until the lawsuit is over, I think the government will never start the proactive recommendations for it.
Mm. Joe, I would like to ask you, the anti-vaxxer movement is very strong almost all over the world, also in Europe. What is
Ukraine, France, very powerful.
right? What is the European Commission doing about this?
Um, Listening to Riko's case is actually really interesting because she's referring to the disinformation playbook. The 4 Ds of disinformation are distort, distract, dismiss, dismay. And the most important, 5th D, is doubt. What the disinformation practitioners want to do is sow doubt. Doubt in our institutions, doubt in our governments, doubt in our journalists, and doubt in science. And by sowing doubt, you confuse people. And you put them into camps of pro or anti-vaccine in this case. And that is what the people who spread disinformation want to achieve. And this is what everybody is trying to battle. This doubt that has crept in science. And this is why it's very important that we deal with disinformation. And one of the aspects of the European Union plan is the code of practice on disinformation. Now, this is the first time ever that the big platforms, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Mozilla, etc., and the big advertisers online, they agree to be bound by a set of rules so as to tackle disinformation. And they include breaking the link between publishing an article which is clearly a lie and monetary revenue. So if, for example, an article appeared saying the capital of Switzerland was going to be moved from Bern to Zurich, which I know Andreas wants, a lot of people would go to that article. And in that article, there'd be adverts. Could be AdSense, AdWords, placed there electronically using AI, courtesy of our friends in Google. So one aspect is to break the economic link so that they wouldn't make any money. Because every time that someone looks at that article about the capital shift, that website makes money. And so he'll write another article, moving the capital from Berlin back to Bonn in Germany, or from Dublin to Cork. And so we're trying to break that link. That's one very important aspect of it. Another very important aspect for us in the code of practice is political advertising, so that everybody knows who's advertising, what they're advertising, and a registry of those adverts is published. This is new. This is very new. And it means that in the run-up to the European elections, the European Commission itself had major problems because Facebook was so strict, the European Commission couldn't advertise outside Belgium. That's one example of how strict the platforms are taking this code of practice. But I have to stress, and I don't want to take up too much time, it's not obligatory. They're not bound by any punitive measures. It is a code of practice and it is voluntary. But it's a good start.
But for instance, could you see during the last general election in Europe, could you see an effect already of the systems that you have introduced?
Yes. Billions of sites have been taken down. I mean that. Billions of sites have been taken down. And there has been no coordinated cross-border effort to spread disinformation. There have been local efforts, national efforts, regional efforts, but no cross-border effort to spread the same lie ahead of the elections. Now, of course, it is difficult to have a cross-border campaign when there are 28 member states, all with their own issues, 24 different official languages. That's tough. So the disinformers have a tough job on their hand, but it was made that little bit tougher by the fact that Twitter demands far more information before you set up an account, and Facebook, etc.
And what are other countries doing? I imagine that you have also looked into that. For instance, I have read some months ago that Russia is also planning an anti-fake news law. France is planning.
That is one of the greatest ironies of our time.
Yeah.
According to NATO, 80% of all disinformation in Europe comes from Russia. 80%. So them doing a fake news plan, that's rich, as we would say in Dublin.
I would like to ask all of you on the panel, what is it a good idea that the state tries to limit the distribution and dissemination of fake news? Or shouldn't it be something that the market could solve as a problem? Maybe Neil.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. So I've been thinking about it a lot, and it seems like the platforms are interested in doing a good job in this area, but they're not. Until this point, they haven't done an excellent job in doing this, and I think the regulator at some point, one time or another, would have to intervene. Now, what kind of intervention that would be, whether that would be like a light-feathered kind of law that puts some code of conduct on them and it's not obligatory, that's one option. Another option is more strict, right? The government can impose, as we've seen in Germany, huge fees on companies that don't take down this kind of content in a fast manner, in a timely manner. Let's say this. But it seems like as of now, or at least as of 2016, the platforms were not doing a good enough of a job in doing this. and I think the public has to step up.
And it is probably important to know, Joe, that it's not the European Commission who decides on which of the tweets, which of the news are fake and which are not. How does that work? How does one determine which news should probably be flagged like this?
Well, the European Commission is absolutely paranoid with the accusation that it will create a ministry of truth, a big brother department. It won't. It will happily pass the responsibility to others. And that starts with journalists and fact checkers. But the platforms will play a big role. They will have to play a big role. The big stick that the European Commission has is the threat of legislation. If the code of practice is not adhered to, if it's ignored, if they don't take down these sites, and if they let these trolls and bots spread disinformation with impunity, then I think legislation in a new commission is possible. I don't want to say probable, possible. Because the platforms, they don't want this either, but they have a huge responsibility. They are quasi-monopolistic entities, but they're also private companies, and they're there to make money. So it's a tough one to say, we're going to forego money for our shareholders in order to appease someone else.
And Scott, what do you think? What is your impression? How prevalent is the problem of fake news in the social media? Is it really such a big problem, or is it only a small minority who is involved in this?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of a hard question to answer, and you can imagine a lot of us are trying to answer that question, and what makes it so difficult is scale, right? So there's a lot of sort of research looks at particular cases of misinformation or disinformation on climate change or political campaigns, but sort of putting that in the context of the total universe of information at any one moment is really difficult. I don't know. People seem really split on if it's a huge problem or it's not that much of a problem. I mean, you're talking about quantity. I don't know. I mean, there's less disinformation than not, certainly. And there's been some really interesting work looking at the ways in which disinformation kind of spreads in particular communities, and the sort of paths that they take can mean that even if there's less quantity of content, it still can have a sort of larger sort of influence and be amplified in different ways. So, as far as attaching sort of numbers to it in terms of scale, I don't know.
For instance, let's talk about Brexit. There were claims that Brexit was also caused by fake news, influencing people by fake news in the social media. Is that plausible from your perspective?
That's funny. So, one of my PIs wrote a report submitted to the UK government where he argued, this is Phil Howard, where he argued that Russian disinformation ahead of Brexit played a significant role in changing people's voting habits. And as evidence of that, he looked at the amount of spread and ad buys. To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I think assessing something like that is impossible. Excuse me, it's not impossible. Really, really difficult. And I'll just say, I'm a communication scholar from the field of communication, and for our entire history as a field, which is 100 years, people have been trying to assess the effects of communication. And we're still not really sure what sort of effect any sort of communication has. I mean, there's certainly lots of arguments and a lot of discussion about that, but actually connecting a given advertisement or a piece of disinformation or an article that spreads to someone's behavior, maybe voting behavior, is incredibly difficult. There is reason for concern, certainly in a case like Brexit. There certainly was a lot of disinformation around it. So.
You were exactly trying this, right? You were really trying to find out who was involved in sharing and consuming and creating fake news on Twitter.
Exactly.
What could you see?
Yeah, so I would give a slightly different answer. Having spent like 2 years trying to answer that exact same question, But before I give you our exact quantity, because I think the question is more about like how do you measure it to begin with, I'll tell you a bit about like how did we approach it. And in order to study this, and that goes back to your point, I think as scientists, we don't have good visibility in terms of what's happening on social media platforms, right? These are companies, this is privately held data. We have APIs, but we have very limited access to data, and in particular, to data about people. You know, on social media, there are many, many different entities like the World Conference of Science Journalists, governments, other actors, that to the best of my knowledge are still not able to vote. So if we just take this bulk amount of data and infer something about people and how much they vote or how much they're influenced by fake news, we'll get a very wrong answer. So to begin to unpack this like prevalence question, we started with a sample of voters in the US and tried to study what kind of content do they get on social media and what kind of content do they share on social media. And in particular, Twitter, because Twitter has this open API, open approach to data sharing, which we could start quantifying things. Now, like us, other researchers from economics, from political science, have tackled this in numerous ways. And I think nowadays the general consensus is that fake news is not yet influencing elections. Now, as Scott pointed out, this is a difficult inference problem. Right? We don't even know if political ads, which campaigns are spending millions of dollars on putting out there, are influencing the way people vote at the end of the day. So, let alone did fake news affect the election. But it seems like for fake news to have an effect as big as political ads have, they would need to have huge influence over one person. So it seems like the consensus among scientists is that it's unlikely that fake news had influenced the election, at least in the US, even in the closest races. That is not to say that fake news is unimportant. And as we see in our work, there are pockets on social media of people who receive a lot of it. Is that 100% of their content? That is not even close. What we see is that at most, even the biggest consumers of fake news receive something in the order of 15% of their content from these what we call as fake news sources. But the question remains is what's going to happen in the next election, right? So at the moment it seems not very likely, but as social media gains prevalence in the general public, as fake news gains prevalence on social media, we don't know.
And did you see any interesting pattern in your sample? People who are more involved than others, and what is typical for a super sharer or a super consumer of fake news?
So in our sample, we had the activity, the sharing and potential exposure for 16,000 voters in the US. Out of these 16,000 voters, what we've seen is that only 16 people were accountable for 80% of the fake news shared. That's 0.1%. That's extremely, extremely concentrated. And in the supplementary material, we buried this analysis that compared it to everything else, to cat videos on Twitter. This level of concentration is exceptional. And
I would agree with that it's a small, tiny cluster of trolls on very dedicated people. But I would just add one thing. This is just a kind of a did you know question. Guess which demographic group is the biggest sharer of disinformation in the world? The over 55s. The over 55s are the biggest sharers in the world. Do you know why? Because they grew up with the printed word. They grew up believing what they read in newspapers. And now the printed word is on their screen or on their tablet, but they still believe it. And so they quickly share it in their social group, be that WhatsApp, be that Facebook, be that whatever it is. They are very quick to warn their neighbors and friends of the same age group. Have you seen this? They are moving the capital from Bern to Zurich. Have you seen that? Younger people, millennials, have grown up in the digital space. They just swipe right or swipe left, say, whatever, this is nonsense. And it's a very interesting thing. The only point I'd add to your point, Near, is disinformation creates silos. And disinformation accentuates silos and builds up bigger walls around those groups. So if you believe that vaccines are bad for you, you will only listen to people and articles that confirm your view. And if you believe in science and facts and indisputable evidence and climate change is real, you will only read science journals, The Guardian, the Financial Times, etc., etc. You won't read Breitbart.
So I disagree to an extent. So in terms of our, evidence from our study, what we see is that 3 factors, age included, are associated with consuming and sharing fake news. The strongest factor associated with consuming political fake news in our data is political leaning, number 1. Number 2 is engagement with politics. So if you're interested in politics, you're more likely to get this content. And third one is age. Now, the age one is really interesting. You laid out one potential mechanism for why older adults may engage with this content. At the moment, as scientists, we don't really know. We don't. What you call as digital media literacy is one possible mechanism, and it's a very interesting one. It could be, result of diminished cognitive capacity. Maybe older adults remember corrections less so than younger people. It could be other reasons. It could be like a cohort effect. The older adults that grew back in the day are acting a certain way, and when I become a 60-year-old, I may or may not share it at the same level. So really the mechanism for why older adults are sharing and consuming fake news at the levels that they do, we don't, maybe I should say just me, I don't yet know what the particular mechanism for this, but I think it's a very interesting problem to tackle.
Scott?
Sorry, I don't mean to beat up on you, Joe, but I also want to push back on the last thing you said. So for a long time, there's been sort of assumption that echo chambers and there's this sort of filter bubble effect, right? Like, so some of these, pretty big name kind of public intellectuals write these books in the early 2000s. Claiming this, and this was the sort of realization of some of that early ideas about the internet, going back to Negroponte and the Daily Me, right? You're gonna have this new newspaper that was completely tailored to the individual. But what some of the research is coming out now in a number of fields is actually pushing back on that assumption about the strength of echo chambers and the strength of that filter bubble. Effect. And what's finding is that things like, what some people call automated serendipity or, incidental exposure. Basically, online, people have actual access to a lot more sort of different sorts of news outlets and information sources as compared to people offline. And so, yeah, this research, the research on echo chambers, I think, is still sort of being debated. In fact, this is one of the sort of big debates going on in our fields right now. But yeah, so just looks, it looks like it may not be as big of an effect as has been assumed.
Yeah, and maybe to put a number on it, it seems like even the highest consuming fake news people in our panel were still consuming, 75 to 85% of their content from mainstream media. So mainstream media has an important role for everyone, and even though there are pockets of people that consume much more of this kind of content from these kind of sources, still mainstream media has a major role of informing people. So selective exposure probably exists, but not as strong as filling your feed with content just from fake news sources.
You said that political leaning was a very important factor. Is political leaning also in your case, Riko, important? the anti-vaxxer movement in Japan, is that also politically inclined to the left or the right?
In Japan's case, it's slightly inclined to left, but the most important thing, well, it's really interesting, ironically, but I was really criticized in social media first, and I was like given, bribed from the pharma company to promote the vaccines, or you're trying to spread the promiscuity to the girls or something like that. But after all these storms of criticism, and after awarded the John Maddox Prize from Nature and things, and then also I was sued from the doctor, and I lost the place, all my regular columns in the newspaper or magazine. So there was no place that I could write but to publish my blogs or Twitter or Facebook. People just started to realize my SNS is much more reliable than mainstream newspapers or TVs in Japan. So in the circumstances when the mainstream media is not reliable, or in the context of losing the confidence of from the public, social media has some potential to spread the real news also. Remember the Twitter caused a revolution too. So it has a potential of using both sides.
You said it's more the anti-vaccine movement is inclined to the political left in Japan.
Slightly.
Slightly, and I think that's different from what you saw in your data, which was mostly conservatives.
Right.
It really depends on the
Which is
country.
which
I
which
guess, yeah.
where we can see that it depends on the topic.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, we focused on politics, and honestly, we focused on one election. So in many ways, we collected a lot of data, but our N is still one. So we don't know, if fake news may shift to the left in the future. Now,
Even
Donald Trump.
about the vaccines in the US, for example, it's both in right and left side of the political group, because Dr. Trump actually used in his election campaign the anti-vaccine movement as one of getting his votes from the religious group who deny the Bible. So, and people who reject vaccination and choose schooling, homeschooling, etc. So it really is pretty much used in politics, but it really depends on the cultural context of the country.
Right. I think you can see this also in the climate change debate in the U.S. and in general the position the two parties have with respect to science, that it changed very much from beginning from the 50s to the 70s, when environmental topics became more important, and universities became hotspots of the Democratic Party, and at the same time the skepticism on the right side against science grew, I guess. But we should talk also about the question: why do people believe? Why do people buy these stories? Joe, do you have an idea?
Well, I disagree with the two academics. I really do believe people are in silos, that they have formed an opinion about something, whatever it is, and that because it's a human instinct to want to reinforce that view. So if you have a view on climate change and you think it's a hoax, you are going to want to seek out articles that reinforce that view. We're surrounded by science journalists here. I'm assuming that science journalists are not divided on the issue. I'm assuming that science is not divided on the issue, and mainstream media is not divided on the issue. So the only way you can get an opinion which challenges it is to go online. And you will just reinforce your view, no matter what your view is. If you truly believe the Earth is flat, do a Google search, and you will find people who agree with you. And I mean any opinion you have, there is a group of people that you will be able to find and share your zany views with. And why they do that, I don't know.
Isn't it possible that people believe in things which they know are wrong? For instance, the climate change debate is, as you said, it is more or less clear. And I would claim that everybody knows that.
But you say it's more or less clear. The President of the United States says it's a Chinese hoax.
Yes, but my claim would be that he can't be serious about this. And also maybe it's just a hypothesis. What do you think? I have the impression that people want to believe something. They know it's wrong, but they want to believe because it fits better with their self-image, maybe with their commercial interests. So they just ignore.
Well, I guess a couple things. So first, I mean, that's a really, I think, optimistic view, I guess, that Donald Trump really, in his heart of hearts, believes that climate change is real. But I think that to step back for a second, I think it is really important to remember that there isn't one problem of false news. There's not one problem of misinformation. There are many, many different problems. There's a universe of problems, and every single case is unfortunately unique in some ways. The landscape around climate change is really different than that around vaccines and the anti-vaxxer movement. And the honest truth is, the anti-vax movement in different countries is really different. And so, I think it is important to just remember that it's hard to sort of draw these sort of general sort of conclusions or understandings about misinformation, right? Looking across these sort of cases. But to go back to your question about, this really basic question of why do people believe in misinformation? And again, this is one of these questions that people are really grappling with. But I guess I'll start by saying, I think maybe a better place to start is, why do people believe information at all, right? Like, why should we believe, right, what we are told? And I think there are a lot of things, right, at play here to sort of tease out what's going on in the problems of misinformation. And you point to things like politics and sort of political economy, right? There's financial motivation for people to believe these things, or certainly to produce disinformation about something like climate. But the truth is, there's a lot of different reasons, and I think these are problems that are overdetermined, right? There's a lot of things. But one last thing I'll flag is it's trust, I think, is a huge thing, and a lot of people are talking about this, right? That we've seen sort of this assault on trust in institutions. That's, I think it gets more complicated when we're talking about science, because there's some survey data out there that says, well, actually, the trust in science has been somewhat stable. But I feel confident saying that generally, in a lot of countries, there has been a sort of decreased in trust in major institutions, journalism, and government being particularly.
I think that's the central point, and it brings me back to your point that why do people believe in information? They believe because they trust. They cannot really judge if it's correct or not, right? So why did science lose trust in so many societies?
I think it's completely opposite, because while the vaccine saved lives is not the news, but vaccine harms people's life is a news. So people only believe in the shocking news or something to be dramatized. So regardless of it, which is true or not true, people just believe in something shocking, and which that kind of information just spreads so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know why people believe what they believe, but I would point out to two studies in this space. So two of them by psychologists. The first one, I'm blanking out on the PI's name, but basically
What's a
they
PI?
ran what?
Private investigator? What's a PI?
Principal investigator.
Okay.
And the experiment they did was really interesting. They asked people to describe how a toilet works, right? Or before they asked them to describe it, they asked them to rate how much they understand how the mechanism of a toilet works. And they rated themselves, then they asked them to write it in words, explain how the mechanism actually works, and afterwards rate it again. And what they saw is that after they asked people to actually explain how the mechanism works, the scores decreased. Basically, after having to explain to a stranger the mechanism of something to great detail, people understood how little they actually understand about things and how much they actually trust on the person in their community who understands how to fix the toilet when it's broken, right? And all of us uses the toilet, on a daily basis. You should expect that we know how the toilet works. But no, we actually rest on that community knowledge in order to resolve the problems. So that's one example. The other one, which goes back to Joe's point a little bit, is the example that my colleague, also a psychologist who studies misinformation, Bryony Swire-Thompson, did, was basically to give people, to test people's belief in some idea, some true, some not, correct the misinformation immediately after giving it to people, and checking a week later how much do people believe that original claim. And what she found, which is very aligned with what you're arguing, is that people over time, even though they're presented with correct information, revert to their original beliefs. So moving people's beliefs is very, very hard, and I don't argue with that. My argument is that in terms of media diet, what people actually consume, and I'm not doubting that, you know, all sorts of crazy ideas circulate online, but their slice of the pizza is fairly small. So, yeah.
Can I bring in the Trump inauguration story now?
Please do.
Sure.
This is the biggest crowd that this auditorium has ever seen.
Certainly.
Fact, as Sean Spicer famously said in January 2017. When people were given a photograph of the Obama inauguration in January 2009 and the Trump inauguration, there was a clear physical difference between the number of people that attended the two inaugurations. But the people who supported the Republican Party and President Trump were less likely to believe that the photograph on the right had less people than the photograph on the left. Because even though they were given facts, that was trumped, for the want of a better verb, by their political views.
Mm-hmm.
So when they're making a decision, even though they're given incontrovertible facts, they still doubt their own eyes and say, no, the Trump crowd had more people.
What does this mean for our job as journalists? Should we even not try to correct things because it's counterproductive, maybe? Or?
Well, journalism is in real trouble because of digital. The amount of journalists these days that join mainstream media organizations that have to churn out 4, 5, 6, 7 stories a day. A day. Not 1 story a week or 2 stories a week, like the old days. And they're under incredible commercial pressure. So if a story turns up, there is a temptation to change the byline, put their own name, change a few words, and quickly repost it and mark that as one of their 5 a day. That's the danger. It's a real danger that journalism and properly picking up the phone and checking a story, that goes away. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because journalism doesn't come for free. It costs money. Andreas, you cost money. I cost money.
Not very much. Scott, you wanted to add something?
Oh, well, sure. So to go back to the point about the Trump inauguration, I think, not to belabor this point, but it is, I think, a really interesting and telling example. But I think the point that it makes is that, you know, as one scholar has recently said, right, like facts are weak. Like facts can't stand up on their own. I think we would like to believe that facts speak for themselves, that the truth is obvious, but that's not true. Like that's not how it works, right? Facts need support. They need infrastructures, diverse infrastructures, right, to hold their validity, like their facticity. And so I don't know why the Trump supporters don't believe the crowd size, but probably it has something to do with their political identification, the identity, right, their rich sort of social lives. I think this points to something really important when we talk about misinformation and disinformation, to sort of understand the complicated social dynamics that these things play in people's lives. That, right, it's never going to be enough. So this ties into the what can we do, right? It's honestly, it's not gonna, I truly believe it's never gonna be enough to just put the truth out there, right? To just fact check, right? And this is not to say that fact checking isn't really important, because I strongly believe fact checking is essential. However, the research out there suggests that maybe fact checking isn't particularly effective, right? And there are a couple reasons for this. One, it doesn't seem to circulate in the same sort of places and communities that the original misinformation happens, and that's a real problem, right? So the same people who believe misinformation or consuming misinformation often don't C don't have access to the fact check, and this, I guess, does go to the echo chamber, right, in a sense. But I think there's something deeper going on, right? Like, fact checking doesn't get at the sort of infrastructures that support, right, the beliefs that people have, right, around misinformation. But if I can go on to sort of what can journalists do, well, I think, in that question, there's really sort of two different questions kind of wrapped in, right? There's one, which is something like, how can journalists kind of not add to the problem of producing misinformation? How can they not write bad articles, right? And this is Joe's point. I think Joe's point is absolutely right, that most of the journalists I know, like I'd probably say all the journalists I know, are doing really good work, and they really want to do, write true content. And honestly, I think they're doing they're doing a good job. However, journalism is in crisis, right? As has been said a million times, right? These are really hard times for journalistic organizations across the world, and journalists are under all sorts of pressures that are sometimes getting in the way of their ability to do the work that they want to do. And so, I think Joe's right that, I don't know, this is a problem that doesn't have an easy solution when the foundations of journalism itself are sort of crumbling. But the second sort of question about what can journalists do, it goes more to the combating misinformation, and that comes to the sort of fact-checking side of things. So aside from fact-checking, which, as I just said, might not be the most effective way, so two points about that. One, even though fact-checking isn't maybe that effective, it is important that there's a record out there, like the record of the day. But I do think there's a space for journalists to sort of get at all of that sort of infrastructure that supports facts, right? I don't know, to get, to help sort of disrupt misinformation by looking at things like the political economy behind it, to report on, as people have been talking about all day, right, the process of science, to help sort of rebuild trust in some of our institutions. I'd like to think that there's a space for there's an opportunity for journalists to sort of contribute to some of these underlying problems, right? Misinformation is, in a sense, a problem, but it's also a symptom of a whole lot of other problems going on. I don't know, I think there's a big conversation there about what can journalists do to sort of combat all of those other problems leading up to this problem. And sorry, that's a long answer.
Thank you, Scott. This was almost a perfect end of the discussion, but we still have time for questions from the audience. Please, we have two microphones in the room.
The biggest audience ever.
Yeah, right, Martin here in the front. The gentleman, please.
Hi there, thanks for an entertaining discussion. I'd like to ask Scott and Nir a question. You alluded a few times about what the research is telling us. Have I got the wrong impression? Are you saying that fake news is not as damaging as we fear it to be, and we shouldn't really be as hung up on its impact?
Should I take this? Sure. Okay. So not exactly. I'm not trying to diminish the problem. What I tried in my work is to put a number on it, to quantify it, and to help us as a society kind of track its prevalence over time. What we're seeing right now, for various reasons, is that fake news is not very big. And it's not very big for two main reasons. One, social or fake news on social media, and let me be precise about that. One, social media is not as big just yet. The most important channel of communication to people is still TV, radio, traditional media, far beyond social media. In the US, as a main communication channel, social media is only 13% of the population is consuming the majority of their news on social media. So in that sense, social media is not that big. It doesn't mean that not everyone uses. A large chunk of the population is not using social media. So that is context number one. Context number two is within social media, or at least within Twitter. We don't really know what's going on in Facebook. The problem is fairly limited to a percentage of the population that is mostly on the right, mostly politically engaged, and older adults. For the average person on Twitter, the rate of fake news sources in their feed is less than 1%. If you think that that could change the result of an election, even in close races such as Maine, that seems highly unlikely. Now, with all of these caveats, could fake news change the results of the next election? I don't know. That's beyond my data. I cannot speak to that. But it is something, personally, I think that this is something we should watch out for and keep an eye on as it develops, as social media grows in prevalence, as a channel for news and in its importance for people. And I think the platforms have a huge responsibility in going beyond their commercial interests in that regard.
Yeah. So that was a fantastic response, but there's just one thing I'll add, which is I think it's really important to think a little bit more broadly about the potential effects, right, that misinformation, false news might have. And so there's a concern you asked earlier about what effect misinformation had on voting, right? But that is only sort of one way that misinformation can sort of act in the world, right? It's not only about changing voting behavior, but it's about changing beliefs, or changing knowledge, or changing practices, or changing values, or changing epistemologies, or changing social relations, changing identity work. There's all these other ways that misinformation might or might not act in the world that, I don't know, we're working on it. I mean, people are looking into it, so.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Yes, please.
Hello. I'm Eberhard Sanger. I'm a scientist and archaeologist. And every once in a while I put out a media release. And then I see how fake news is actually produced by the media out of the media releases that we have distributed. In my experience, for one media that is actually researching an article and writing an article, there are 10 out there who are copying it and translating it into other languages. So let's say our media release is picked up by a new scientist, and it's a very proper article, but then maybe an Hungarian online media is translating it using Google Translate into Hungarian. And I actually have cases where people are then translating it back from Hungarian into English, not going to the New Scientist article. Yeah, and there's nothing basically left that is related to our original news. And this is happening at a very large scale.
Thank you. Yeah, that is exactly the problem that Joe just mentioned, that the workload is so high in some of the in some newspapers and online media especially, that people don't have time really to fact check their articles. And yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think the real problem of fake news is not on Twitter or Facebook. It's a real authorized fake news on newspaper or TV, or probably spread by scientists or doctors who seems to have authority. People believe in this information more than some Twitter accounts. So we have to be really careful about all these mainstream media.
Yep.
Right. Are there more questions? Yes, please, over there.
Hi, I'm Beth Baker from PLOS, the publisher. I was really interested in what you were saying about over 55s and how much they share fake news. And I was curious about, since your hypothesis is that maybe they're more trusting in news, how that translates into their trust in science. Are they more trusting generally of professions, or is all this fake news making them doubt scientists? Thanks.
I haven't spoken to all of them, Beth, but my guess is that it will chime with their political views. That if they, and remember, most people over 55 tend to be more conservative in how they vote, and if they trust the newspaper and that they are reading, whatever type of newspaper that is, and that newspaper calls science into question, then yes, they are more likely to doubt scientists. It seems to be the evidence that we've seen.
maybe I'll just add that I have a grant proposal in the pipeline to test exactly that. So once I discover, I'll let you know.
Great.
Leah,
I was
can
just
you
wondering
email
about
all of us
compared-
on that, actually?
Sure.
I was just wondering about compared to younger people as well, whether you have any data on that.
Is that for me, Beth? Any of you? Okay. I don't have any specific data on it, more than the evidence suggests that young people are more digitally native. They've grown up digitally, and you see them even walking around the university here, staring at phones the whole time, and that seems to be the evidence. But young people tend to be more concerned about stuff like HPV and climate change than older people, and that's based on science.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Yes.
Hi, I have a question for Joe. You mentioned that there was no EU-wide or even cross-border effort to spread fake news in the last EU elections. My question, and you slightly alluded to this, is that in the UK it was basically the second Brexit referendum, but I'm sure in Portugal or Greece or wherever that's not what voters were thinking about. So how do you know that it's not just because there are different issues in different countries and therefore it doesn't make sense if you're organising fake news to do it across borders and not your efforts or the voluntary code of ethics that you were talking about? Do you know? Is it possible to know?
I don't quite understand the question, but
Sorry.
having spoken to basically electoral authorities in a number of member states, in the month of April, there were general elections in Spain, Finland, and Estonia, and I spoke to the electoral authorities, the head of the electoral authorities in those three countries, and they said that they didn't see much evidence of disinformation. So they were general elections. As for the European Parliament elections held at the end of May, yeah, every single member state has its own issues. For example, that you're either it was an anti-Macron vote, or in Italy it was a pro-Salvini vote, that kind of thing. Every country had a different perspective to the elections, and they were going to vote in or vote out, not based on pan-European issues. That seems to be the evidence we have thus far. And I'm sure that didn't answer your question. I didn't get your name, I'm sorry.
Benjamin, sorry, it kind of does. I was just asking, do you know whether it's just that, like, every country has its own issues, so it doesn't make sense if you're the grandmaster of fake news to try and do something cross-border? Is that the only reason?
That seems to be the evidence. If you're sitting in St. Petersburg at the Internet Research Agency and you've got, whatever, 1,000 very, very super coders and trollers and that kind of, like, is it worth your while trying to do a pan-European campaign of disinformation when there's 24 different official languages and 28 different jurisdictions, not to even begin to talk about regional disparities and all that kind of stuff? It's not worth your while financially. Whereas if you can pick certain issues, you can go for them.
Beyond the problem of fake news, maybe a word to any of you about what I consider to be a major problem. I mean, the crazy algorithm of Google News for the spread of completely irrelevant, of misleading health information.
Who wants to answer the question?
So what was the question exactly? I mean,
about the fact that Google News is a big actor of the spreading of completely irrelevant or misleading health information.
So maybe I can take this one. So I've been at a misinformation workshop at Google like a few months ago, and you know, I'm not speaking as a Google representative by any means. I don't have any data about this. I by no means know how the algorithm exactly works or if it's spreading health misinformation.
If you did,
but
you'd be a much wealthier man.
probably. But what Google pointed out, a number of people there pointed out that in terms of structured information about health on the web, there's a real crisis of availability of that kind of data. And they're active, and you know, Google perceive themselves as a mediator to information. So they're not going to produce that information themselves. They contact the other sources like the National Academy of Sciences, trusted sources that could provide this kind of information, and encourage them to use the kind of schemas and the kind of structures that will allow their algorithm to perform better. Has that happened just yet? I don't think so, but you know, that as much as I know about this issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Nia, for that reply. And time is up. I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking part in the discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it an interesting discussion. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good continuation of the conference. Thank you.